get ready because I am about to make you go WTF on your childhood and crush your little childhood nostalgic heart a little bit, because today we're talking about how Dr. Seuss was racist. Yes, we are talking about the same Dr. Seuss, the Cat in the Hat, the rhymer, the man, Dr. Seuss, the one you probably grew up with when you were a child. So let's start with a little bit of background and context as to why I'm talking about this and how I myself found out that Dr. Seuss, the one we all know, was racist. So essentially on my Instagram account for my Asian American clothing brand called AA Batteries, one of the accounts that I follow is Teach and Transform by Liz Kleinrock, who is an educator who kind of teaches on different issues like racism and diversity, specifically focused for the youth. But essentially one of the posts that she recently made was about how you should like ditch your nostalgia and just recognize the fact that Dr. Seuss actually was very, very racist. And so that was kind of like the title card, and I was like scrolling, I was like, whoa, hold up, probably the same reaction you might be having right now. And then I scrolled through the little Instagram slider and I was like, are these photos real? Like, are these actual screenshots of, you know, illustrations from Dr. Seuss's books? And they were. And then after that, got to corroborate that with some extra research online. And so I typed in like Dr. Seuss racist, or like, was Dr. Seuss a racist? And bam! Google was right there with me, because there were a bunch of very, very recent actually news articles talking about, you know, some of his racist imagery and just some of his themes in some past books that I think often were overshadowed because, as I've already said many times, the Dr. Seuss that we're thinking of, you know, was lauded by many a childhood teacher. Obama talked about him in like 2016, calling him, you know, like a very, very great writer, something like that. But essentially you wouldn't think that this is the Dr. Seuss that we all grew up reading. I think Stephen Colbert even made a video about Dr. Seuss's racism. So that's kind of the context. And so to get into it, you know, I'm talking the talk a lot about how Dr. Seuss was racist. So you're probably like, okay, just get to it. Show me the actual examples. Now that I've done the talking, show me. And first, some context, just to note, of course, your older Asian sister is going to focus on some of the racist Asian imagery that Dr. Seuss used. But of course, and unfortunately, it was not just Asians that he was racist towards, and essentially many, many people of color were poorly represented. But I'm going to focus on the Asian depiction and kind of touch on some of the others, but just know that before I get into it. So to give a high-level data point before we actually get into each of the books and the examples that were racist in terms of their imagery and their themes. So a 2019 survey of Dr. Seuss's books was done, and he has about 2,240 human characters, but only 2% of those characters were depicting people of color. And that single data fact alone already started to baffle me because, well, one, I was like, there were over 2,000 human characters in his books? I just remember many an animal. But then besides that, the just very harrowing and horrifying fact that only 2% of them were people of color. And not just, you know, 2% were Asian. No. All people of color, Black, Latinx, Native American, Asian, yeah, that whole group over there, yeah, only 2% of them were really represented in his books. And that's just one very, very high level layer into some of the absurdities going on. But when you actually dig into the portrayals of people of color that were included, many of them just perpetuated really harmful stereotypes, whether about Asian Americans, which I'll kind of get into, or they were perpetuating like white superiority, white supremacy, and anti-Blackness, all things we do not love. But for more specific examples, let's start off with one of the books. So in one of the books, If I Ran the Zoo, a white boy holds a large gun while standing on the heads of 3 Asian men. And in that same book, it also features 2 men from Africa who are shirtless, shoeless, and wearing grass skirts while holding an exotic animal. You know, essentially a lot of the body of work that Seuss has is just like very, very demoralizing, dehumanizing to people of color, essentially equating them oftentimes to animals or things that you can like hunt or take control over. And also in the book, and to think that I saw it on Mulberry Street, which I definitely read growing up, I just do not remember this. must have wiped out a big part of my childhood memory. Or then again, my memory is not perfect, so that's another thing too. But you'll see stereotypes of Asians, including an illustration of a man with a bowl of rice, a conical hat, the one that if you think about the stereotypical hat, that's the hat, and slanted eyes caption, a Chinese man who eats with sticks. And if you're curious, the full 6 books that are being pulled from publication are, and to think that I saw it on Mulberry Street, If I Ran the Zoo, McGilligut's Pool on Beyond Zebra, Scrambled Egg Super, and The Cat's Quizzer. I don't really recognize all those books, but maybe that's a really good thing because that means they're not super popular, and because they also have tropes that are xenophobic, and ultimately these books are written for young kids. And that gets into the next part. Why is this such an important topic that I'm making a video about it? 6 books are being pulled from publishing. And it all, for me at least, stems to the fact that the audience is young children, right? Like imagine when you were a kid, the books that you read, the shows that you watch, they stick with you and oftentimes influence how you behave or how you see the world. And I'm not just like making that up and being like emotional. Like there is actual research that shows that children are more heavily influenced by the content that they are reading and consuming at a younger age, and it will actually influence their behavior, right? And so if you give children these racist pieces of imagery or these, you know, racist stereotypical books, especially say if there are kids who live in an environment where they don't get to see people of color and this is the only exposure that they see, right? Obviously that's really skewing their perception, and they'll grow up thinking that they can call, you know, Asians people with slanted eyes, because yes, that's what Dr. Seuss called us, and hopefully you know that's not true or okay to say. And it is also puzzling to me because Dr. Seuss has written some books that do talk about, you know, discrimination and condemn it, of course, like The Sneetches or the Lorax, which talks about an important topic of environmentalism. So if he's willing to write about topics like that, even touch on discrimination and denounce that, it just doesn't make any sense to me that, you know, he'd write these books that clearly just have so much wrong in them. Like it's so objective how horrible they are, and he even has said himself that he's like sorry for, you know, the hurtful depictions that he included in his books in the past. And I think also, beyond the fact that this is an audience of young children, the influence that Dr. Seuss has as an author for this target audience of young children is like magnificent and just immense. You know, anytime you think of a children's book, you're probably going to think Dr. Seuss as one of the authors. And so that power, of course, comes with great responsibility. And so when you're depicting characters in a way where, you know, 1, they're not represented, right? Only 2% are people of color, and then 2, when you do depict them, it's just blatantly unjust. And it's just scary to think that there are young kids who have already grown up with this content. You and I probably grew up reading it as well, and luckily they're not in the books that are probably the most popular, you know, like Green Eggs and Ham or Cat in the Hat, but it's still under the same author, and an author that the public just reveres usually. And the last thing I wanted to talk about was what are the next steps for these books, right? So I told you that 6 of the books are being pulled from publishing. And this is more of a conversation question, but I'm just curious, like, what do you all think should be done with these books? Is it right to pull them from publishing? I read this article that said essentially canceling Dr. Seuss isn't the way to go, but outwardly condemning him and why the books are wrong is more important. That's not the exact title, but that's essentially what I'm getting at. And I do agree with that author because in some senses, sometimes showing kids the wrong way of doing something can be just as educational, or even more for some, than the right way to do it, right? So in my ideal world, I would kind of imagine that, you know, they would like republish the books either with some sort of like intro statement saying like, warning, like there will be racist depictions on page 6 and 9 or whatever, so beware, skip them if you're a parent, right? Because many times also the kids who are reading this might not be able to read it on their own, their parents are reading it to them, or if it's a library or facility that already has these books, kind of doing the extra legwork to, you know, put a little label on the book, in the book, or on the pages can definitely help. Just recognize that whatever you're reading is clearly wrong, clearly racist, but that once you label it, then you can learn like, ah, we shouldn't be doing that. So in my brain, that's what seems the most right course of next step. I totally get though, by just pulling the books from publishing, it's just a safer bet because you can ensure that like no kid is reading the books and misinterpreting them or being wrongly influenced, right? Because even if you have a label on a book, like if a kid gets a hold of it and doesn't really understand what the label means, but they just see the little illustration of this like Asian dude with like the braid and the triangle hat that I don't even want to think about anymore, and the slanty eyes, like that's all he's really gonna take out of it. He's not gonna be like, oh, the label said not to interpret it like that. So that's kind of what I'm thinking, but I'm really curious to see what you all think and to see some of the kind of double-sided response essentially to the books being pulled from publishing. There are some that are saying like banning books with censorship, right? And then some that are saying it's for, you know, the safety and health of children and so that they have better learning and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I hope your childhood mind isn't blown too much, and that if you're watching this, you probably weren't negatively influenced by some of the xenophobic and racist imagery in Dr. Seuss, because you are great enough to listen to a video about why it is racist and was racist. So trust the system, XOXO, your older Asian sister. The one you didn't know, you had.